I don't believe in miracles. When you grow up at the bottom, invisible and overlooked, you learn that the world isn't a fair place. Dreams are for the rich. Survival? That's for people like me. And who am I? My name is Yoon Hee. I've been working as a maid at the Park Mansion for almost 2 years now. The first time I stepped inside, I knew it wasn't just a house. It was a palace, built for royalty. Marble floors so smooth you can see your reflection. Chandeliers that shine brighter than the stars I never had time to wish upon. And the Park family? They're the closest thing to royalty in this city. But the one person I can't stop watching is Lillian Park, the billionaire's daughter. She's my age, yet we live in different worlds. She has it all: beauty, power, freedom. I never hated her for it, though. Envy, sure. But hate? No. Not until she threw it all away. It all started with a dress. Lillian had closets packed with designer clothes, shimmering gowns, sleek blazers, silk skirts, each one bearing a price tag I couldn't even imagine, clothes that she tossed aside like they were worthless. "You can take whatever you want," she said once, barely glancing at me. "I'll never wear half of these anyway." At first, I didn't dare touch them, but curiosity's a tricky thing, and one evening I found myself holding a pale blue silk dress against my chest. It felt smooth as water, gliding over my skin when I slipped it on. For a moment, I stood there in front of the mirror, barefoot but transformed. In that dress, I wasn't Yoon Hee the maid. I was someone else, someone important. One afternoon, while tidying Lillian's desk, I saw her passport, carelessly tucked under a pile of papers. I knew it was about to expire. She'd mentioned it offhandedly the week before. "Get it renewed for me," she said, tossing the responsibility to me like it was a piece of trash. A few days later, everything fell apart. My mother, who had been clinging to life in a dingy hospital for months, passed away. She was the only reason I stayed in the city, the only family I had left. I wasn't ready. I thought I had more time to save, to give her a proper funeral, to tell her I'd finally made something of myself. But life is never that kind to people like me. Desperate, I went to Lillian's father, my employer. I begged him for an advance, just enough to cover my mother's funeral expenses. But his cold, dismissive gaze cut through me like a blade. Looking through a pile of invitations to events, he declared that he can't be bothered with this right now. Next week is Lillian's birthday celebration. That was all, my mother's life, reduced to a nuisance. I stood there, frozen, as he waved me off like an annoying fly. With nowhere else to turn, I tried to ask Lillian for a few days off. Surely she'd understand, but when I approached her, pleading for just a little time, she exploded. "Why did your mother have to die right before my birthday?" she yelled, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against the counter. Her words hit me harder than any slap could. There was no sympathy, no humanity, just annoyance. To her, my grief was an inconvenience. Something inside me broke at that moment. I quit on the spot, throwing my apron to the floor. And as I walked out of that mansion, crushed and heartbroken, tears blurred my vision. I couldn't even afford to bury my own mother. I was desperate, and desperation makes people do things they never thought they were capable of. That night, sitting on a park bench with nothing but my mother's funeral notice crumpled in my hand, the world felt impossibly cold. I had nowhere to go. No job, no family, no future. I wiped the tears from my face and marched back to the Park Mansion. It was dark, and the staff had retired for the night. I slipped into Lillian's room, my heart pounding like a war drum. The designer bag she always carried was lying on her vanity. I knew exactly where she kept her cash, thick wads of it, enough to cover my mother's funeral 10 times over. I emptied the bag without hesitation. And then I saw it. Her passport, right where I'd left it. Next to it, her master's degree from Yale University, the one she boasted about at every party. My hands trembled as I stared at the documents. I could leave behind this miserable life forever using these documents. No more scrubbing floors, no more begging for scraps, just freedom. I stuffed the passport and degree into my bag, feeling both terror and exhilaration flood my veins. The morning Lillian left for Europe, I stood at the mirror, holding her passport in my hand. For a long moment, I stared at my reflection, at the girl I'd been all my life, a maid, a nobody. I spent nights pacing my small room, calculating my next steps. My unfinished education at the local university weighed on me like a curse, just another reminder of how close, yet how far I'd been from a decent life. Without a degree, the corporate world was locked behind iron gates. I could have spent years trying to climb that wall on my own, only to hit dead ends. But with Lillian's credentials, everything could change. The opportunities I'd never had were suddenly within reach, if I was brave enough to reach for them. I wasn't stupid, though. I knew that slipping into Lillian's shoes wouldn't just be about faking my way into a new life. It required patience, precision, and complete control. I needed to become Lillian Park, not just on paper, but in every detail. I studied her documents carefully, the courses listed on her degree, her past internships, the places she frequented, the brands she wore. And then, when I felt ready, I took the leap. The day I walked into my first interview, I forced myself to remain calm, projecting the cool, effortless elegance that Lillian wore like a second skin. At each company, the interviewers smiled warmly the moment they saw her name on the resume. Yale opened many doors. My fabricated internship experiences were met with approval, and the way I parroted business phrases made them nod with satisfaction. One of the recruiters leaned forward during an interview and said, "You've had an impressive journey, Lillian. Why do you want to start with an entry-level role?" I smiled, a carefully rehearsed response rolling off my tongue. "I believe in building a solid foundation, even with an advanced degree. I want to grow with the company and understand it from the ground up." She was impressed. I chose the most promising company, a rising star in the financial industry. It wasn't the highest offer, but I could see the potential for growth. It was a calculated risk, and I wasn't just looking for a paycheck. I was building a life. The first few months were surreal. Every morning, I pull on the mask of Lillian Park. At work, I learned quickly. I stayed late, attended networking events, and absorbed everything like a sponge. I wasn't just surviving in this world, I was thriving. Soon, my salary increased. I rented a better apartment with a view of the skyline that still took my breath away every morning. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to count every penny or skip meals. And the best part? I was no longer miserable. At work, my colleagues invited me to exclusive events, gala dinners, fundraisers, and private parties where high society gathered. I dined with CEOs, shook hands with politicians, and exchanged pleasantries with socialites. I even started dating Ji Hyuk, the CEO of the company where I work. Now I was standing shoulder to shoulder with them, sipping champagne as if I belonged, and in time I started to believe I really did. But there were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, when the weight of what I was doing pressed down on me. Late at night, in the stillness of my apartment, I'd lie awake wondering, what if someone found out? I knew the risks. If the truth came out, I'd lose everything and even go to prison. But every time that fear crept in, I reminded myself of how far I'd come and how impossible it would be to go back. Life has been good. I'd made it, or so I thought. I had a great job, a beautiful apartment, and I was even dating the CEO of my company. I was finally someone important. But fate has a cruel way of reminding you who you really are. As we entered the restaurant, a girl coming from the opposite direction bumped into me, dropping her bag. Instinctively, I knelt to help her, murmuring, "I'm sorry." I handed back the fallen purse, but when I looked up, the air froze in my lungs. It was her, Lillian Park, the real Lillian. For a second, my heart stopped. She stood there, her gaze drifting over me with that same disinterested expression she always had back when I was her maid. She didn't recognize me, at least not immediately. Her brows furrowed, like she was trying to place me, but then she shrugged it off. "You look familiar," she said casually, as if the universe hadn't just collapsed around me. I gave her a tight, awkward smile, mumbled an excuse about needing to leave, and bolted from the restaurant. My friend called after me, confused, but I didn't care. I stumbled into the street, gasping for air like I'd been drowning. The walls of my new life felt like they were closing in on me. For weeks after that encounter, I lived in constant fear. Every knock on the door made my heart race. Every text message felt like a threat. I barely slept. I knew it was only a matter of time before Lillian figured out who I was. Or worse, told someone else. The idea of her walking into my office, exposing me in front of my colleagues, or even confronting my boyfriend made me sick with anxiety. At work, I became paranoid. I even started to avoid my boyfriend, afraid that my shaky demeanor would tip him off. It came exactly a month after that fateful encounter. A sleek black envelope slipped under my door. There was no name on it, just a time, a place, and a message that sent a chill down my spine. "I know who you are. Come alone, or everyone will know the truth." I stared at the note, my hands shaking. The weight of the words sank in slowly, suffocating me with fear. My instincts screamed at me to run, to disappear before things got worse. But I knew I couldn't. If she told the world who I really was, it would destroy me. I had to go. That night, I arrived at the address written on the invitation, a desolate building on the outskirts of the city. The streetlights flickered dimly, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest, I was sure anyone nearby could hear it. The place was dark and abandoned, like a setting from a nightmare. For a moment, I thought I was alone, and relief washed over me. Maybe it was just a sick prank. But then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. I froze. It was her, Lillian Park in the flesh. She stood there, elegant and untouchable, her lips curling into a sneer as she looked at me with that same arrogant gaze she used to have when I was just the maid. "Yoon-hee," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. She knew. There was no point pretending anymore. I knew this moment would come. Sooner or later, the past always catches up. "I am sorry, Lillian. I really didn't want to do it. I had no other choice," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Just tell me what you want. I'll do anything. Please, let me finish it soon and I will disappear." Lillian's smile deepened, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She took a step closer, and I could feel the venom in her words. "Did you think I wouldn't recognize you? Imagine my surprise when I came back to the country and met my maid and checked what she was doing now. You really amazed me. I didn't expect that a mouse like you was capable of such deception." She diabolically laughed. "I want my life back, Yoon-hee," she said softly, like a predator playing with its prey. I'll leave," I stammered, panic rising in my chest. "I'll disappear. You'll never hear from me again, I swear." But Lillian shook her head slowly, savoring the moment. "It's not that simple." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "If you want to keep your life, you'll do something for me." "What do you mean?" "There's someone I needed gone, my ex-husband. You will kill him." The world tilted beneath my feet. Kill? My mind raced, unable to process her words. He has shares in the company, Lillian continued, as if discussing the weather. I want them transferred to my name, and you're going to help me to do that. I shook my head frantically, my voice cracking. No, I can't do it. You can! Lillian cut me off, her smile widening. And you will. If you don't, she tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with malice. I'll tell the police exactly who you are, and you will end up in prison. I stood there, paralyzed by the weight of her words. If I refused, she'd expose me. Everything I'd built would crumble to dust, the life I'd stolen would vanish, and I'd be left with nothing. But if I did what she asked, I'd be crossing a line I could never return from. Lillian watched me closely, enjoying every second of my torment. Do we have a deal? She asked, her voice light, almost playful. I whispered, yes. After Lillian's sinister demand, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, kill her ex-husband and forge his shares into her name. It was unthinkable. I wasn't a murderer. The idea of starting over in another country crept into my thoughts more often each day. I could leave it all behind, my job, my relationships, my fake life as Lillian. Maybe I could become someone new again, somewhere far away. But Lillian's texts kept coming like a ticking time bomb. The clock is running out, she reminded me after a few days, her words gnawing away at my resolve. She gave me 1 month to carry out her demand, and as fate's cruel joke, her real birthday would be at the end of that deadline. One evening, Ji-hyuk, the head of my company and the man I was dating, called me to his office. He had noticed my sudden withdrawal. He wanted to know why I had been avoiding him. I stood across from his desk, trying to muster a convincing lie. Did I even love him? Or did I only love the attention, status, and protection he gave me? The answer wasn't hard to find. I didn't even miss him in the days we hadn't seen each other, but Ji-hyuk, I could see it in his eyes, in the small things he did. He was in love with me. I told him that I was feeling stressed and overworked, hoping he would drop the subject. He gave me a suspicious look, narrowing his eyes, but said nothing more. In the following days, I felt weird. Someone was watching me. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, but the feeling wouldn't go away. While walking through the city, I would catch glimpses of figures that vanished the moment I turned around. It wasn't long before I knew for certain. Lillian had someone following me. She didn't trust me to complete her task and wanted to make sure I wouldn't escape. Determined to make sense of the situation, I began researching her ex-husband. What I found left me stunned. I had already crossed paths with him during a business meeting set up by Ji-hyuk. He was the heir to a major car company. Returning home one evening, my phone rang. Lillian. Meet me tonight. When I arrived at the Japanese restaurant she had chosen, the hostess escorted me to a private booth. Lillian sat there, sipping tea with a sly smile, her eyes sharp and calculating. So, have you thought about how you're going to do it? How will you kill him and get his shares transferred to me? Her casual tone made my stomach turn. I looked at her, trying to keep my voice steady. Lillian, I can't do it. I'm not capable of something like that. She leaned forward, her smile fading into a cold, hard expression. You think I'm stupid? I know you're trying to buy time, but listen carefully. Whether you succeed or fail, your time is up by the end of the month. The way she looked at me made my skin crawl. I knew that even if I did what she asked, she would eliminate me. She had already decided I was disposable, just another pawn in her twisted game. Leaving the restaurant, I felt the familiar weight of someone's gaze on me again. The watcher was still there, lurking just out of sight. There was no way out of this without consequences. With only a week left until Lillian's birthday and the final deadline, I finalized my escape plan. I booked flights under a false name, packed light, and mapped out routes to the airport that avoided surveillance. I would leave everything behind. But just as I was ready to leave, the news broke. The heir to the car company, Lillian's ex-husband, was dead. I stood frozen in front of the TV, watching as the anchor explained that he had died by suicide. They said he left behind a letter full of regrets about losing his beloved wife and announced that he was transferring his shares to her. The report mentioned his struggles with drugs and depression following the divorce. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and dialed Lillian's number. When she picked up, her voice was smug. "So, you did it after all." "No, Lillian," I whispered, barely able to steady my voice. "It wasn't me, I swear." The smugness evaporated from her tone. "What do you mean? I didn't kill him," I repeated, gripping the phone tightly. "If you don't believe me, ask the person who has been following me. They can confirm it." A chilling silence followed. Then Lillian's voice returned, now laced with disbelief. "I never assigned anyone to follow you." My blood ran cold. "What?" Lillian was silent for a long time. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "If it wasn't you, then who? That coward wouldn't have killed himself. I wanted him dead, but he wasn't capable of doing it himself." The days after that call felt like a blur. Lillian stopped contacting me altogether, leaving me adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Has someone else killed him? If so, who and why? And were they watching me, waiting for me to make the next move? Meanwhile, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't keep living this way. I had lost myself entirely. In pretending to be Lillian, I had become someone I didn't recognize. A shadow, constantly running from one lie to the next. Were my choices even my own anymore? Or had I been chasing Lillian's desires all along? For years, I thought I had wanted this life, the power, the status, the attention. It all felt intoxicating at first, but now I wasn't so sure. What if it had never been my dream? What if I had been running away from myself all along? The morning sun streamed through the windows of the office for the last time as I stepped inside, my mind already set on leaving it all behind. This was my final day, one last time to pack my things and walk away. But fate had other plans. As soon as she walked through the glass doors, Ji Hyuk's assistant appeared, informing her that the CEO wanted to see me. When I entered, Ji Hyuk was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Without turning around, he spoke. "Are you happy, Yoon-hee?" Ji Hyuk turned to face her, his gaze sharp. "Are you happy to leave me like this, after everything I've done for you?" My breath hitched. I stared at him, stunned. I don't understand." "After everything I did for you, you're just going to walk away? Abandon me? Even after I solved the problem with Lillian Park?" My lips parted, but no words came out. My mind raced, piecing everything together. The man I had been pretending to love, the man I thought I knew, was a monster. Ji Hyuk had been behind it all. The surveillance, the murder, the perfectly staged suicide. And he had done it all for me. I forced myself to smile, though every nerve in my body screamed in terror. I didn't realize you did that for me." Ji Hyuk's expression softened as he stepped closer, wrapping me in a gentle hug. "Of course I did. I told you, I'll do anything for you." He pressed a kiss to my lips. "You never have to worry about anything, Yoon-hee. I'll always take care of you." My heart pounded painfully in my chest, my mind racing with a single thought. How the hell do I escape? She stayed in his arms, pretending to be grateful, pretending to be relieved that he had solved her problem. But inside, her thoughts were spiraling. She had to get out of his grasp, out of Lillian's reach, out of this entire nightmare that had consumed her life. That night, Yoon-hee executed her escape plan. She didn't pack much, just enough to get by, and left everything else behind. Her passport, forged documents, and a one-way ticket were all she carried as she disappeared into the night. She would vanish, just as she had done before. Only this time, she would be herself. Five months later, in a quiet coastal town in New Zealand, on the other side of the world, Yoon-hee started over, this time as her true self. For the first time in years, she felt free. Sitting by the window with a warm cup of tea in hand, Yoon-hee let her thoughts drift back to Japan. The trip had been her only chance to escape Ji-hyuk, and she had taken it without hesitation. She could still remember the sterile hotel lobby, the soft hum of city noise filtering through the windows, and the weight of the guard's watchful gaze. The pill had dissolved so easily into his drink. Her heart had raced as she watched him slump forward, just enough to give her time. She'd slipped through the dark streets of Tokyo, a single bag clutched in her hands, her breath shallow, as if Ji-hyuk were only a step behind. At the airport, her fingers had trembled when she handed over her fake passport. The sound of the boarding call for Vietnam still echoed in her mind, like a thread pulling her out of the nightmare. Yoon-hee shifted her gaze to the peaceful New Zealand landscape, her tea cooling in her hands. Vietnam felt like a fever dream now, a restless blur of narrow streets, humid air, and nights filled with fear. She'd hopped between cheap hotels, constantly looking over her shoulder, expecting to see Ji-hyuk's men in every shadow. That plane to New Zealand felt like the first real breath she had taken in years. And now, sitting in this quiet place, surrounded by rolling hills and distant waves, the weight of her memories began to lift, little by little. With every sunrise, Yoon-hee reminded herself of one thing. She was no longer running. She had found her way back to herself. In the end, I lost everything, but maybe that's what I needed. To lose everything, just to find out who I really was. So, who am I?